1 Timothy 2:5, there it says, "For there is one God, and one mediator between God and men, a man, Jesus Christ, who gave himself a corresponding ransom for all, what is to be witnessed to it is at its own particular times." So it clearly connects the description of him as a man with the man, Jesus Christ, who gave himself a corresponding ransom for all, right? That was when he was a man. And so that's why he's referring to him as a man. But that does not mean that at the time Paul's writing this, or at the time in which Paul was converted, like we read about in Acts, that Jesus was a man. Well, Trinitarians will say, well, yeah, that's what you say, Greg. It still says it's a man. Yeah, it may connect it with what he did as a man, but it's still calling him a man as the mediator. Okay, fine. Then let's go back to Galatians, the text which began this series, and which is obviously more directly connected with the issue of God being one in contrast to the mediator, right? So if 1 Timothy 2:5 calls Jesus the mediator between the one God, again differentiating him, but calls him the mediator as a man, okay, well, can Trinitarians use that to say, well, it doesn't call him the God-man there, right? So Trinitarians would have to argue he's only a man as a mediator. He's not mediating in any way as part of his divine self, because 1 Timothy 2:5 doesn't say that, does it? Right? So it either is only a man, which is what it says in 1 Timothy 2:5, that he's a mediator, a man, or it's referring to him in the historical sense that I'm arguing about, or that I'm trying to demonstrate, and that I believe is directly connected in the very next verse in that text. Okay, so can we cite anything else that might sway the argument one way or the other as to whether or not he's a man as the mediator, and so could also be a man as the mediator in Galatians 3:20 and still separate from the God who is one in that text? Well, I'm still going to argue that it defines God as one there, not three or even two. But now let's focus in on the question. Can he still be in contrast with the mediator because of it being his human self, and so in some sense still be a person of the God who is one? Let's take a look at Galatians 1. Paul, an apostle, neither from men nor through a man, but through Jesus Christ. Paul's writing, same Paul who writes a little bit later on in the same letter, obviously, right? But it almost has to be pointed out because of the way Trinitarians talk and describe Jesus as a man in the mediatorial sense, in which he can still be contrasted with the God who is one in Galatians 3:20. So look at Galatians 1:1. Paul, an apostle, neither from men nor through a man. The same Paul that wrote 1 Timothy 2:5, referring to Jesus in the historical sense as a man who gave his life, being the mediator between the one God and men, here says he is an apostle, neither from men nor through a man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. Who's mediating here? Is Jesus mediating, and did he reveal himself to Paul after being raised to life by the Father in Acts as a man? No. It says right here, neither from men nor through a man. But that's not the only text that makes this clear. Take a look at verse 8. However, if we or an angel out of heaven, what's an angel? Angel out of heaven in this case, more specific, right? That's a spirit, is it not? Not a man? So Paul is clearly aware of the differences in nature between spirits and men. He says he wasn't made an apostle from men or a man, but from Jesus Christ, pointing out that he's not a man. Then he speaks about angels from heaven who may declare something as good news beyond what they've declared and to not listen to it. And he repeats it in verse 9, and then look at verse 10. Is it in fact men I am now trying to persuade, or God? Or am I seeking to please men? Right? So he clearly understands human nature, angelic nature. He's been talking about it since verse 1. Right? The Father raised him up from the dead. Right? And he specifically referred to that in 1 Corinthians 15:45 as a spirit resurrection. So he's very aware of how things work. He describes it all the time. And he says in verse 11, I put you on notice, brothers, the good news which was declared by me as good news is not something human. Okay, so the good news, the great message, right? What God promised to remove sin and death long ago, right? It's from God, is it not? Genesis 3:15, the seed, the promised seed that's talked about throughout Galatians 3. We discussed in detail in part 2 of this series of videos. The good news is not something human. It's from God. It's from heaven. Neither did I receive it from man, nor was I taught it except through revelation by Jesus Christ. Is Jesus Christ a man? Nope. Only in the historical sense in which he gave his life. Just like 1 Timothy 2:6, the verse right after 5 says. Because when Paul is given a chance to make explicit what kind of person Jesus Christ is, what does he do? Not a man, not something human, didn't receive it from a man, but from Jesus, the non-human. And that's why I say in Galatians 3:20, the mediator, who is contrasted with God, right here as well, from verse 1 forward, leading up to chapter 3, verse 20. The mediator who is contrasted with the God who is one is not a man. It's this Jesus Christ, the one who is in heaven, the one whom the Father raised up from the dead as a spirit. 1 Corinthians 15:45. All right, so there is no human nature that Jesus has that he can use, or that Trinitarians can use, and that would say he's using, right, to do things like he does in Revelation 3:2 and 12, or in other texts where he seems to be less than the Father. The fact is, when he's referred to as a man, it's in a historical sense in which he lived as a man. But when the texts speak of his nature after he was raised by the Father, it's not as a man, not as something human, but from Jesus Christ, in the sense in which John also was given a revelation by Jesus, like Paul, and the Spirit that is described like in the clip that I showed from part 1 in Revelation 1 and 2, which I talk about more in my Sons of God and pre-Christian text videos, and my Michael and Jesus as the Biblical Archangel video series. So I encourage you to take a look. But it's very clear. The mediator in Galatians 3:20 is not a man. He's not even a man in 1 Timothy 2:5. He's just referred to as the man who gave his life. The mediator between God and men is the one described all over the place as a non-man, whether as light in his encounter with Paul, or whether as a spirit when Paul's describing his resurrection, whether in contrast to a man or a human like we see here in Galatians 1, or when it comes to describing the features of the resurrection body of Jesus in Revelation 1 and 2, which match remarkably well with the description of other spirits like we read about in Daniel. So there is no biblical teaching to rely on to explain away texts where God is called one in contrast to Jesus as the mediator. There is no text which allows Trinitarians to default to a human nature argument as if Jesus has two and he always is divine in one sense, but he can be less than divine in another. That doesn't exist when it comes to the biblical text. Jesus was a divine spirit in the beginning with the Father. John 1:1, we'll get to another video in further detail. He became flesh, like John goes on to further describe in verse 14 of his prologue, and then was raised to life as a spirit. 1 Corinthians 15:45. Descriptions are consistent with that, and Paul is also clear when it comes to where he received his information and conversion through not a man, not something human, just like the great message, but from Jesus Christ, right? The Spirit in heaven, not with a human nature that limits him. Nothing is consistent with that in the biblical text, except the failure to read texts like 1 Timothy 2:5 in their context.